Do you have any idea what the absolute must-have food items were that people hoarded during the Great Depression? In hard times, folks clung to anything and everything they could possibly get their hands on. I warn you, some of these items might come as a surprise today, but back then they were a mandatory pantry staple. People didn't give up their morning buzz when coffee got too pricey, they just got creative. Chicory root, the Great Depression's favorite coffee substitute, was every house's pantry staple. This unassuming plant was dug up, roasted, and ground into a powder, becoming the secret weapon for caffeine cravings when actual coffee beans were out of the question. It wasn't a new idea. Chicory coffee had been used in Europe for years, but the Depression brought it into the American home. The root gave brews a slightly nutty, earthy flavor, and some people said it made their coffee taste richer. But others weren't so sure, saying it tasted like burnt wood. It was cheap, caffeine-free, and most importantly, available. Chicory was often harvested by families themselves, pulling roots from ditches and fields to stretch their dwindling budgets. What was once a pesky weed became a pantry essential through a little ingenuity. Chicory coffee, as it turns out, has lasted and is still a regional favorite in places like New Orleans, where it's served with beignets for a taste of Southern charm. Chicory root was a lifeline during the Great Depression, but it's now an optional indulgence. That was before fancy cafe culture. It was about finding comfort in a cup when life wasn't comfortable. The magic of salt pork was always something you could count on during the Great Depression. This heavily salted slab of fatty meat was a lifeline for families trying to stretch meals to infinity and beyond. Refrigeration was a luxury for many, and salt pork's long shelf life made it an indispensable pantry item. Salt pork wasn't just a food, it was an ingredient, a seasoning, and sometimes a main course. It flavored beans, greens, and soups, enough to give even the simplest dishes a little indulgence. When we were leaner, we'd fry up a small piece of salt pork and use the rendered fat to cook everything else. The result? A meal that had the feel of more meat than it actually had. However, it wasn't all plain sailing. The salt pork was so salty that it often had to be soaked or boiled before eating. It was affordable, versatile, and practically indestructible, a trifecta of survival during tough times. Salt pork is much more likely to appear in gourmet kitchens than in emergency pantries today. But back then, it was a salty superhero, rescuing countless Depression-era meals from bland oblivion. Hominy was a humble kitchen staple during the Great Depression, and it stretched far and wide. Hominy puffed up into soft, chewy nuggets made by soaking dried corn kernels in lye. Yes, lye, and as versatile as they were filling. Hominy may not have been glamorous, but it did the job. Hominy made its way into soups, casseroles, and even as a side dish fried. A texture party, it gave simple meals a satisfying chew. It became the base for Southern favorites like grits for those who could afford a little extra seasoning. It was a hearty, starchy savior on lean days for everyone else. Hominy was often prepared in large batches, which they dried and stored for future use. This wasn't just food, it was an investment for the long term, so you wouldn't go hungry. Making hominy wasn't exactly convenient, but it was worth it when food supplies were low. Hominy is still a staple in some cuisines, but it's long since faded from everyday American tables. But for those who lived through the Great Depression, this unassuming corn product was a lifeline. And once again, necessity is the mother of culinary invention. Hardtack, also known as the cracker that could survive the apocalypse, was a Depression-era favorite for those wanting to stockpile something that wouldn't spoil. It was a rock-hard biscuit made of nothing but flour, water, maybe a pinch of salt. Nothing special, but dependable. Hardtack was a legacy food, one with military rations and sailor diets pedigree. It was a Depression-era hit because families could stash it in pantries without fear of spoilage. Plain, it was like gnawing on a brick. It was almost edible, but softened with soup, milk, or coffee, it became almost edible. Emphasis on almost. Hardtack was bland, but there was something charming about it. It was cheap, easy to make, and incredibly filling. It was the base for many families' meals when ingredients were scarce. It thickened stews, broken into crumbs, or was an impromptu plate when real dishware wasn't an option, left whole. Today, hardtack is more of a historical curiosity than a pantry must-have. However, during the Great Depression, this humble cracker represented resilience. It wasn't fancy or flavorful, but it kept people going when times were tough, and that's what mattered. Kraut juice. It's just what it sounds like. During the Great Depression, fermented cabbage brine was a go-to pantry item, prized for its versatility and surprising nutritional benefits. It was a byproduct of sauerkraut making, and wasting it was out of the question. Straight down the throat for its purported health benefits as a cooking liquid for soups and stews, or even as a splash to bland foods to add flavor. Basically, it was the Depression-era version of an electrolyte drink, thought to help digestion and keep people going when fresh produce was scarce. But the taste was divisive. You either loved it or learned to tolerate it. Kraut juice had its good points too. It was cheap, it kept forever, and it was surprisingly rich in vitamins and probiotics. It was a lifeline in a jar for families with limited resources. Kraut juice has faded from the household staple, but it hasn't gone away altogether. Some old-school recipes still use it, and occasionally it's sipped as a health tonic. For the people who lived through the Great Depression, Kraut juice wasn't a health trend. It was a necessity. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, one briny sip at a time. I never knew fat could be the unsung hero of the Great Depression. Sweet, the solid white fat from the loins or kidneys of sheep and cows, was much more than a pantry staple. It was a survival tool. Sweat was once prized for its versatility, being used in cooking, baking, and even non-food uses such as making candles and soap. When resources were scarce and people had to make the most of every morsel, it was the original all-in-one solution. Sweat was a game-changer in the kitchen. It gave the dishes of meat pies, puddings, and dumplings richness, which helped to make them hearty enough to stretch a meal for an entire family. During the colder months when energy reserves were important, its high-calorie content made it essential. Suet wasn't just for savory dishes either, with recipes like suet pudding turning this otherwise savory staple into a sweet one. In addition to its utility, suet was available. It was often considered a byproduct by butchers and sold cheaply, so even the most cash-strapped families could afford it. It was also easy to render and store and kept for months when properly handled. Suet has pretty much disappeared from modern kitchens, but it occasionally makes an appearance in traditional recipes. It was more than just fat to those who lived through the Great Depression. It was a lifeline in Lard's clothing. When the Great Depression hit, sorghum syrup ruled the roost as the king of sweeteners. Honey maple syrup be damned. This thick, golden brown liquid was made by boiling down the juice of sorghum cane, and it was a lifeline for families trying to sweeten their lives without breaking the bank. It was affordable and versatile enough to earn a permanent place in Depression-era pantries. Sorghum syrup was not just a sweetener. It was a source of vital nutrients such as iron, calcium, and magnesium. It wasn't just tasty, it was functional, in an era when balanced meals were often a luxury. Sorghum on a biscuit, cornbread, or oatmeal could make a meager breakfast something special. It even made its way into sauces, marinades, baked goods, and even into ice cream. Sorghum syrup production was a community affair. During harvest time, people gathered in entire neighborhoods to crush sorghum stalks and boil the juice into syrup. It was labor-intensive, but it was also social, and it forged bonds even in the darkest of times. Back then, it wasn't about foodie trends, but today, sorghum syrup is experiencing a small renaissance in the culinary world. It was about survival, resourcefulness, and getting as much goodness as we could out of the land. Sorghum syrup wasn't just a treat for Depression-era families. It was a symbol of sweetness that endured in hard times. Pickled vegetables were the ultimate solution for long-term nourishment when fresh produce was a fleeting luxury. Families in the Great Depression knew how to make their gardens work overtime, and pickling was a go-to way to stretch the harvest into lean winter months. If it grew, it could be pickled. Cucumbers, green beans, cabbage, and even watermelon rinds were preserved in tangy brine. The process was simple but ingenious. Jars were packed with vegetables, vinegar, salt, and spices to become shelf-stable pantry stars. Preserving food with pickling didn't just preserve the food, it elevated it. Pickled vegetables gave sharp, zesty flavors to otherwise bland meals, bringing a taste of summer to the dead of winter. Pickling was more than a food preservation method. It was a communal activity. Neighbors swapped jars, families shared brine recipes, and pickling became a way to connect during hard times. Nothing was wasted. Even scraps that would have otherwise been discarded had a second life in the pickle jar. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Pickled vegetables are a trendy addition to charcuterie boards these days. But during the Depression, they were a necessity. But for families who were barely making ends meet, a pantry full of jars of pickled vegetables wasn't just a source of food, it was a source of pride and security. Canned liver wasn't the most comfortable food, but it was a lifeline during the Great Depression. This pantry staple was a nutritional powerhouse, packed with protein, vitamins, and minerals, and didn't require refrigeration, a godsend for families without access to fresh meat. It was metallic and mushy, but on a day when every calorie mattered, canned liver did the trick. The canned liver was a surprisingly versatile food. It could be spread on bread for a quick meal, mixed into casseroles, or fried up with onions to make something almost palatable. Its rich flavor, sometimes too rich, made it a cheap way to feed a family because a little went a long way. Canned liver can even be blended into meatloaf or meatballs, stretching meals without sacrificing protein for those willing to get creative. Canned liver is a rare thing today, but its legacy lives on as a symbol of frugality and resilience. It wasn't about taste or presentation for Depression-era families, it was about survival. A tin of canned liver in the cupboard was evidence that even the most unappealing ingredients could keep you alive and give you hope when things got the toughest. Evaporated apples came to the rescue when the orchard was empty and fresh fruit was a distant memory. These dried slices were a Depression-era treasure, lightweight, shelf-stable, and could take a plain dish and make it special. During the cold months, fresh produce was scarce, and a jar of evaporated apples was worth its weight in gold. Evaporated apples could be rehydrated in water and turned into pies, crisps, or cobblers, bringing the essence of autumn to winter tables. In addition, they were also a sweet addition to oatmeal, pancakes, or even savory stews. Evaporated apples were different from canned fruits. They didn't need sugar or preservatives and were an affordable and natural choice for frugal families. The resourcefulness of the drying process itself was a testimony. Apples were often sliced thinly, and families would place them out in the sun or hang them on strings to air dry. Even bumper crops didn't go to waste with this low-tech method. The flesh and the core of every apple were used. Dried apples are today a popular snack, but during the Great Depression, they were a symbol of ingenuity. It's hard to imagine something as simple as eggs without a chicken coop, but during the Great Depression, powdered eggs were a reality. These dehydrated wonders became a staple in American homes, providing a protein-rich solution that didn't spoil and didn't require refrigeration. Powdered eggs could sit on a pantry shelf for months, unlike fresh eggs, and that was a godsend for families facing uncertainty. When you mixed powdered eggs with water, you got something that was like scrambled eggs, kind of. Powdered eggs were bland and grainy, but when there were no other options, powdered eggs did the trick. They weren't just for breakfast. Home cooks used them in baked goods, soups, casseroles, and even puddings. Powdered eggs were versatile enough that even the least equipped kitchen could create quite a number of dishes without a single cluck in sight. Cheap powdered eggs were available, and they were a favorite item for government relief programs, which made them available to struggling families. Their utility extended beyond homes. Powdered eggs were shipped overseas to soldiers during World War II to make sure troops were nourished even in the most remote locations. Powdered eggs are now a must in emergency kits and camping supplies, but during the Great Depression, they were a sign of resilience. Dried peas may be the wallflowers of the legume world, but they were the unsung heroes of many kitchens during the Great Depression. These little green powerhouses were tiny, nutrient-packed, and incredibly cheap, just the kind of food that families could stretch their food budgets as far as possible. In particular, split peas shone brightly as the star ingredient in hearty soups and stews. A handful of vegetables, maybe a scrap of salt pork, simmered with a pot of water made a meal that could warm bellies and spirits. The peas themselves were a solid dose of protein for those who couldn't afford meat and helped families stay nourished when times were tough. A near-infinite shelf life also came from dried peas. They could be stored in jars or cloth sacks and could last for years, making them a reliable choice for households that wanted to prepare for lean months. Peas were often grown by rural families, which dried and preserved them for the winter, or city dwellers went to market stalls to get their supply. Dried peas have been overshadowed by the flashier ingredient, but their legacy remains. They remind us that sometimes the simplest foods are the most dependable, feeding families through economic storms with a few handfuls of green perseverance. Powdered milk was there to step in when fresh milk wasn't an option. Powdered milk was a marvel of food science, transforming surplus dairy into a shelf-stable product that didn't require refrigeration, a crucial feature for families without electric ice boxes during the Great Depression. Technically, a few scoops of powder whisked into the water made a liquid that resembled milk. The taste was more chalky than creamy, and the fresh stuff had a richer flavor. But powdered milk wasn't about luxury. It was about survival. It was a base for soups, sauces, and baked goods, making it one of the most versatile Depression-era pantry items. Families with children found powdered milk especially important because it meant kids got a steady supply of calcium and protein, even when fresh dairy was not available. It was also affordable, which meant it became a favorite among relief programs, which distributed it to struggling households. Powdered milk was a lifeline for families living far from the nearest dairy farm in rural areas where refrigeration was scarce. Today, powdered milk is used mostly for emergencies and backpacking trips, but it played a big role during the Great Depression. It was a symbol of ingenuity and resilience, taking something as simple as milk and turning it into a survival tool in a world of scarce resources. Let's just forget about steak dinners. Canned fish was really the MVP during the Great Depression. Cheap and convenient protein for families on razor-thin budgets came in the form of sardines, salmon, and even mackerel, which found their way onto dinner tables across America. The ultimate grab-and-go meal was sardines packed in oil or water, straight from the can, smashed onto bread, or spread with a little mayo and a lot of hope they could be eaten. Canned salmon was a heartier option for casseroles, patties, and soups, stretching one can to feed an entire family. The salty, slightly fishy flavor wasn't for everyone, but when you were hungry, you didn't complain. There were other advantages to canned fish as well. It was shelf-stable, good for months without refrigeration, and small enough to transport. A favorite with travelers, hobos, and relief workers, it was a meal that even the most transient lives could count on. Canned fish is still around today, but it's not what it used to be. But in the 1930s, it was a lifesaver, showing that even the smallest catches could mean the biggest difference when times were tough. Barley is not glamorous, but it was a culinary workhorse during the Great Depression. This ancient grain was a go-to ingredient for families who wanted to fill empty stomachs without emptying their wallets. Its biggest strength was its versatility. It gave soups and stews heartiness, porridge a stick-to-your-ribs breakfast, and even found its way into bread and dumplings. Depression-era dishes got a comforting depth from their chewy texture and nutty flavor, proving that simple ingredients could still be satisfying. Barley was a resilient crop, growing well on poor soil and surviving harsh weather, which farmers liked because it meant they could count on it to grow even in uncertain times. It is stored beautifully once harvested, good for months in cool, dry places. Barley thus became a staple of the pantry for rural families and urban households alike. Barley wasn't just about food, it was about community. In hard times, neighbors gathered to share recipes and tips for stretching their barley supply, creating a sense of community. Barley is today a niche ingredient, celebrated for its health benefits and rustic charm. During the Depression, it was a survival tool. showing that even the most humble grains could keep a family together through the worst of days. The underdog of the Great Depression pantry was turnips, the scrappy little root vegetable that was always at every table. Turnips, with their peppery bite and rock-bottom price, became the saving grace for families who were stretching every penny. Turnips were not just a root to roast, mash, or toss into soups, but a kitchen multitasker. So many families stockpiled turnips during those lean years because they could turn a bare-bones meal into something hearty and comforting with just one turnip. Poor soil was no problem for turnips, which made them a good crop for struggling farmers. In a root cellar, they could last for months without spoiling, making them ideal for winter when other fresh vegetables were long gone. But creative cooks came up with ways to bake them into casseroles, pair them with potatoes to stretch a mash further, or pickle them for a tangy treat. Sweetened turnip puddings, for instance, surprised many with their richness. Even desserts weren't off limits. Turnips aren't a staple of the grocery cart these days, but they've worked their way into farm-to-table menus and rustic recipes. They weren't a trendy choice back then, but they survived in vegetable form. In the Depression era, parsnips were Depression-era gold. They sweetened hard times with their distinct, not very exciting flavor. Parsnips were unlike finicky crops. They didn't mind poor soil or cold weather. In fact, a frost made them taste better. These pale cousins of the carrot were loved for their versatility and their ability to stick around all winter, making them a must-stock for any frugal household. If you had parsnips in the pantry, you were in for something delicious, or at least filling. Parsnips were boiled, roasted, or mashed, and were a blank canvas for creative cooks. They gave soups and stews a hint of sweetness, and could even be used in place of potatoes as a pinch. In fact, they were so reliable a crop that they often ended up in desserts, contributing their natural sugars to cakes, custards, and puddings. They weren't just tasty. They were nutritious and full of fiber, vitamins, and potassium. Parsnips have been trendy root vegetables for modern foodies, but in the 1930s, they were a staple that kept families from hunger. For a generation that lived through the Depression, saltine crackers were Depression-era superheroes in disguise as mere squares of humdrum dough. Saltines stretched scarce ingredients further, providing the fill-in-the-gaps when bread, flour, or even meat ran short. Break them into milk for breakfast? Done. Canned goods? Layer them with them for a makeshift casserole? Absolutely. A rare treat. Toast them with cheese? Heaven on a plate. Saltines were cheap, long-lasting, and endlessly useful, so families stockpiled them. Because they were shelf-stable, they stayed fresh for months, a game-changer when grocery trips were out of the question. Saltines were also a change in texture and flavor from food that got monotonous, which was often the case during the Depression. They were neutral, so whatever was on hand could be put on them: peanut butter, jelly, or leftover gravy. Today, they're often overshadowed by their fancier cracker cousins, but saltines still have a nostalgic charm. In the 1930s, they were more than a snack. They were a survival tool, and sometimes the simplest things were the biggest things. The Great Depression was no reason to skip gelatin packets, which were pantry staples and culinary alchemy in powdered form. Gelatin was a cook's best friend because of its uncanny ability to turn liquid into solid, allowing it to stretch ingredients farther than anyone thought possible. Why was gelatin so popular during the Depression? First of all, it was cheap and easy to store. The packets could sit on the shelf indefinitely, waiting for the day when a family had to pull something out of the cupboard, something that looked like a real meal. Gelatin was even used to make mock recipes that looked like expensive foods, so families could enjoy a taste of luxury on a shoestring budget. In the 1930s, gelatin was a sign of ingenuity and resourcefulness, but today it conjures up images of wobbly Jell-O molds at family gatherings. Its culinary heyday may be over, but gelatin is a nostalgic reminder of how far creativity can go when times are hard. The Depression-era workhorse of the pantry was cracked wheat, which turned simple grains into meals that fed body and soul. This unassuming staple was cheap, hearty, and endlessly adaptable, a lifeline for families trying to stretch a dollar. Cracked wheat was boiled into a porridge-like breakfast, used in place of pricier grains in bulk soups, or simply used as a cheap alternative to pricier grains. This coarse, nutty grain wasn't just filling, it was packed with nutrition, providing a steady supply of fiber, protein, and vitamins. It stored beautifully in burlap sacks, ready to rescue meals when other ingredients ran out, and its long shelf life made it ideal for stockpiling. Cracked wheat was baked into bread or stuffed into vegetables to make a hearty dinner. In fact, it was used to stretch ground meat in patties or meatloaves, so a little meat went a long way. Cracked wheat doesn't enjoy the spotlight these days, but it's a staple in many cuisines around the world, and so its staying power is proven. It wasn't a trendy health food back in the 1930s. It was survival on a plate. Cracked wheat, chewy and cracked, tasted of resilience and making do with what you had in every bite. During the Great Depression, canned tomatoes were the unsung heroes, adding a splash of color and flavor to a drab dinner table. These little cans of sunshine were lifesavers, turning even the blandest of meals into something you could eat. Canned tomatoes were the Depression-era kitchen's MVP, the versatile ingredient that could be used in soups and stews, sauces and casseroles. Cheap, easy to store, and full of enough acid and flavor to perk up just about anything, including your spirits, they were. There was more to tomatoes than taste. They were nutritional powerhouses. They were high in vitamin C and helped keep scurvy at bay when fresh fruits were unavailable. And, because they had a long shelf life, families could stockpile them without fear of spoilage. Families also canned tomatoes from their gardens to last them through the winter. Rows of gleaming mason jars in a cellar, each holding the promise of a warm, flavorful meal when times got tough, wasn't unusual. Canned tomatoes are still pantry staples today, but we might forget how simple they are. They weren't just a convenience back in the Depression, they were a lifeline. And sometimes the smallest luxuries can be the biggest. During the Great Depression, corn syrup wasn't just a sweetener, it was liquid gold. It was cheap, endlessly versatile, a pantry staple that helped stretch sugar supplies and satisfy sweet cravings when dessert options were slim. Corn syrup was a baking ingredient, but it was also a problem-solving ingredient. It sweetened oatmeal, preserved fruits, replaced expensive honey or maple syrup, and even found its way into homemade candies and frostings. Corn syrup was the next best thing for families with a sweet tooth but no budget to indulge. One of its hidden talents? It also acts as a secret weapon in making food last longer. Jams and jellies were often made with corn syrup to keep them fresh for months. It also ended up in Depression-era classics like pecan pie or molasses cookies, where it gave simple ingredients a rich, gooey texture that made them seem decadent. Modern critics might snicker at corn syrup's nutritional downsides, but during the Depression, no one cared. It was cheap, it was plentiful, and it kept families fed. It was a small but meaningful taste of happiness for kids lucky enough to get a corn syrup-laced treat. Dried navy beans are the perfect meal when you're on a budget and want something filling and endlessly adaptable. These humble legumes were a lifesaver during the Great Depression, when meat was out of reach, providing protein and sustenance. Their small size and mild flavor made them a good base for soups and stews, baked beans, and bean patties. Navy beans were ridiculously economical as well. That single bag could feed a family for days, especially if you add rice, cornbread, or whatever odds and ends were in the pantry. They lasted practically forever on the shelf, and that made them an excellent stockpile item for lean times. The best part? These little powerhouses were nutritional dynamos, packed with fiber, protein, and iron, just what you needed to keep energy up when work was hard and food was scarce. Navy beans were transformed into savory dishes seasoned with salt pork and sweetened bean pies that were surprisingly tasty. They weren't exactly exciting, but they were reliable, and that's what mattered. Navy beans are still a staple in many kitchens today, but back then they were a symbol of survival. Depression-era families depended on them, simple, sturdy, and essential, one bowl at a time. During the Great Depression, walnuts and pecans weren't just a tasty snack, they were a prized resource for cash-strapped families. These nuts could be harvested, stored, and used to jazz up otherwise plain meals if you had access to a tree or a generous neighbor. Cracking nuts was labor-intensive, but the payoff was worth it. A rich, fatty ingredient that gave texture and flavor to bread and cookies, stuffing, and casseroles. In the South, pecans were a common sight, falling straight from the trees and into resourceful hands for those lucky enough to live there. The shells of walnuts were tougher, but the reward was similar. Nuts were also very nutritious, with healthy fats, protein, and vitamins that were hard to find in other foods, and they stored well and could even be bartered or sold when money was tight. Depression-era families used them to make nut-based candies, nut milk, and even to top their cornbread pudding. Classic Southern pies needed pecans, and walnuts made their way into cakes and confections. Walnuts and pecans were a luxury that came from nature in a time of indulgences that were rare. Back then, they were a little piece of heaven in tough times, and today, they're a treat. During the Great Depression, cabbage wasn't just a vegetable, it was practically a survival mascot. Cabbage was cheap, hearty, and ridiculously versatile, and it became a Depression-era darling. Cabbage stretched meals and stomachs alike, whether it was boiled, fried, pickled, or turned into sauerkraut. Cabbage's long shelf life was one of its biggest selling points. A head of cabbage could be stored for weeks, making it a perfect stockpiling food. It was also a prolific grower that did well in backyard gardens and was an endless source of greens for frugal families. It was a powerhouse nutritionally, with vitamin C, fiber, and antioxidants to ward off illness and keep people going. A popular option was pickling cabbage into sauerkraut to add tangy flavor and preserve the vegetable for months. During the Great Depression, cabbage was a lifesaver, but today it might not seem glamorous. The humble charm of it is that it is so adaptable and can turn the simplest of ingredients into something satisfying. Next up is the infamous garbage plate. Before you start raising eyebrows because of the name of this one, just hear me out. So this was basically a mishmash of whatever was on hand. Imagine a plate filled to the brim with macaroni salad, home fries, baked beans, and some kind of protein like sausage or ground beef. And don't forget the toppings: chili, onions, mustard, and your choice of hot sauce or ketchup. Sounds appetizing, right? The garbage plate originated in 1918, the garbage plate, and became the signature dish of Rochester. If you missed out on it, don't fret, because it's still served by numerous restaurants under names such as Rochester Plate, Trash Plate, or Simply Plate. This meal was a classic when wallets were tight back in the day and there weren't many gourmet options on hand. Plus, it had all the carbs and fats you needed to keep going through tough times, and the kids loved it. What's not to love about fries and macaroni? This dish is a classic example of don't judge a book by its cover, or in this case, by its name. It's delicious, right? Nothing unusual about this one. It was a classic hit. Prunes were a popular choice during the Depression because they were cheap, stored well, and were, well, let's just say, effective. Many prominent figures during the 1930s ate frugally, just as most Americans did during the Great Depression. To promote the support of frugal and thrifty eating, Eleanor Roosevelt served prune pudding at formal White House functions. And that's how prunes became all the rage. The fruit was cooked until soft, mashed up, mixed with water and sugar, and a bit of flour or cornstarch to thicken it up. This dessert might not win any beauty contests, but it was a sweet treat that many families enjoyed. Prunes are not the most, luxurious of items out there. I'm sure you pass by prunes in the grocery store without even glancing at them, but they were a lifesaver for our taste buds back in the day. You know what that calls for? A place for them in your cart next time you go grocery shopping. Okay, this next one sounds like some kind of alien food, but Depression cake and war cake are just a few of the titles this cake has. It proved that even if things were economically bad, people still had a sweet tooth. It was not just a silly craving, but a sign of comfort and a reminder of more normal days. After all, actual cake was way out of the question when people had to live off of $5 a week and feed their entire families along with it. Depression cake, as glum as it sounds, was a very welcome addition to most people's baking roster since it substituted milk with water, baking powder with eggs, and shortening instead of butter. This significantly reduced the cost of making a cake, and it was one of the things that started mock cuisine in America. Speaking of cakes, hot water cornbread was also a not-so-close but close enough alternative to your regular layered delights. It was made in a pan, and the batter was shaped into cakes before being fried in hot fat to add that iconic crisp that nothing else had. Seriously, this thing gave fried chicken burgers a run for their money in retrospect. Then some salt and boiling water was all you needed. It had a perfectly crisp exterior that crumbled in your mouth perfectly, while the inside was tender, warm, and very reminiscent of Grandma's cooking. Probably why it caught on as much as it did, since most of these ingredients managed to get the long end of the stick with inflation. Let's talk a little about snacking, shall we? So one very popular munch-heavy snack was biscuits that went along with this gravy made out of sausage drippings, and it actually enhanced the flavor more than you would think. Americans already ate a lot of biscuits before the Depression took place, but afterwards, they became a godsend. We are serious. Finding an extra biscuit was an entirely different experience in that era. Popular brands like the 1930s vintage car or the bourbon biscuit, Huntley and Palmer's, all kinds of biscuits that people could get their hands on were in hot demand, since you would never know if dinner or breakfast was guaranteed. Best to bide your time with some biscuits in that case. If they come with a killer dip, then that silver lining shines just a bit brighter. Pancakes and cutlets were not the only comfort cooking people made out of the vegetable we just talked about because it is oh so resourceful. Potato soup was also a regular item at the top of the menu. People would usually use whatever basic vegetables they had to make the soup more varied, but even potatoes, some grounded black pepper and water went fine. Typically, though, people would barter for a few onions or carrots to spice the soup up for special occasions. Here's a sandwich combo that might make you do a double take. Peanut butter and mayo sandwich. Yes, you heard that right. Before PB&J sandwiches became a thing, peanut butter and mayo sandwiches was all the rage. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, this one tastes far better than it sounds. In the 1930s, peanut butter and mayonnaise were both affordable and readily available, making them a popular pairing. The creamy, salty peanut butter mixed with the tangy mayo created a unique flavor combination that some people swear by to this day. It might sound strange, but remember, during the Great Depression, you ate what you could afford, and this sandwich was cheap and filling. So, if you're feeling brave and want to try something new, make yourself a peanut butter and mayo sandwich. Who knows, you might discover a new guilty pleasure. Speaking of cakes, hot water cornbread was also a not-so-close but close enough alternative to your regular layered delights. It was made in a pan, and the batter was shaped into cakes before being fried in hot fat to add that iconic crisp that nothing else had. Seriously, this thing gave fried chicken burgers a run for their money in retrospect. Then some salt and boiling water was all you needed. It had a perfectly crisp exterior that crumbled in your mouth perfectly, while the inside was tender, warm, and very reminiscent of Grandma's cooking. Probably why it caught on as much as it did, since most of these ingredients managed to get the long end of the stick with inflation. Who would have thought that weeds could be a meal? Well, during the Great Depression, dandelion greens were a common sight on dinner tables. This vitamin-packed ingredient is foraged by Italian immigrant women in New York City. These bitter, leafy greens were rich in vitamins and minerals, making them a nutritious addition to any meal. People would often sauté the greens with a bit of bacon or lard, garlic, and onions to balance out the bitterness. They could also be used in salads or added to soups and stews. So, if you ever spot dandelions growing in your yard, remember that they're not just weeds. They're a delicious and nutritious green that can be enjoyed in a variety of ways. Just make sure they haven't been treated with any chemicals before you eat them. Another meatless option, lima bean and peanut loaf, was a creative way to get your protein during the Depression. It's made by combining cooked lima beans, peanut butter, and breadcrumbs to form a loaf. The result was a savory loaf with a nutty flavor and a satisfying texture. It was an excellent meatless option for families looking to stretch their food budget. Plus, it was a great way to use up leftover beans and peanuts, ensuring nothing went to waste. Lima bean loaf allegedly tastes a bit like falafel, but is best with lots of highly seasoned gravy. This dish might sound a bit unusual, but it was a creative solution to a common problem: getting enough protein without emptying their pockets. Next up, a dish that sounds almost too simple to be true: tomato sauce with mashed potatoes. I know, it doesn't exactly scream gourmet, but remember, we're talking about a time when people were just trying to survive. This combo was a way to stretch those precious few ingredients. During the Great Depression, potatoes were a cheap and filling staple, and tomato sauce was an easy way to add flavor. This dish was essentially a plate of creamy mashed potatoes topped with a savory tomato sauce. It might sound a bit unusual, but this combination was a hit because it was cheap, easy to make, and comforting. Plus, potatoes were versatile. You could mash them, fry them, or bake them depending on what you had. So, if you're ever in the mood for a simple yet tasty meal, try tomato sauce with mashed potatoes. Let's see if this humble dish can impress our modern taste buds. Up next, we have a dish that was all about making the most out of simple ingredients: spaghetti, boiled carrots, and white sauce casserole. It can be argued that Eleanor Roosevelt did the best she could during the Great Depression. The First Lady promoted dishes to encourage savvy homemakers, such as a casserole made from spaghetti, boiled carrots, and a simple white sauce of milk, flour, salt, and butter. The spaghetti had to be cooked for 25 minutes. The idea was to get the noodles mushy so they paired nicely with the boiled carrots and a penny's worth of creamy sauce. The result? A vehicle for nutrition and nutrients. Families loved this dish because it was versatile and could easily be modified based on what was available. It was a great way to fill up hungry bellies without breaking the bank. It still makes a pretty delicious meal for potlucks, so if you want to impress everyone with something easy to whip up, the spaghetti, boiled carrots, and white sauce casserole will do. Back in the day, when you were out of just about everything except sugar, flour, and fruit, a vinegar cobbler was your only option. No surprise that it was also known as one of the famous desperation pies. Desperation pies are pies in American cuisine made using staple ingredients like butter, sugar, eggs, flour, and any other ingredients that cooks had on hand to complement them or substitute for ingredients that were out of season or too expensive. These pies were more common before refrigeration and canned pie fillings, and during times of hardship like the Great Depression and rationing of World War II. When fresh fruits were hard to come by, people turned to vinegar to mimic the tartness of fruits like apples and lemons. This cobbler used a mixture of vinegar, sugar, and spices to create a filling that, when baked, tasted surprisingly similar to a fruit cobbler. Instead of chunks of fresh apples, those on a budget would use apple cider vinegar to fake the acidic taste. The crust was made from basic pantry staples like flour, sugar, and butter or lard. The dish reportedly tasted like a custard made from salt and vinegar chips, a rare dessert that leaves the roof of your mouth tingling. Cracking walnuts was hard enough, but cracking a squirrel's skull for dinner was even harder. During the Great Depression, squirrel brains were not only a source of protein, but in some rural areas, they were a delicacy. These tiny morsels were often fried, scrambled with eggs, cooked into a stew, or any other way to get the nutrients out of them, but it made your stomach turn. Prepping squirrel brains wasn't for the faint of heart. You had to hunt and clean the squirrel, then extract the brains without losing too much to the process. According to them, they had a creamy, almost buttery texture with a flavor that was earthy or gamey. In parts of the country where game was plentiful and other protein sources scarce, squirrel brains became a symbol of survival. This dish is all but extinct today, thankfully, but it's a reminder of just how far people were willing to go to fill their plates during hard times. Fish mold is too much of a good thing. Picture chunks of canned or leftover fish, suspended in gelatin, formed into an eye-catching mold and served cold on a bed of lettuce. This dish sounds like a prank, but it was a Depression-era invention. Fish mold was both a presentation piece and a way to stretch ingredients. To mask the fishy odor, flavored gelatin was combined with mayonnaise, lemon juice, and sometimes even cream cheese. For texture, vegetables such as peas or celery were added. When it was once molded and chilled, it became a central piece to family dinners or potlucks. Why did people eat it? Simply put, gelatin was a trendy ingredient at the time, and it was economical. It was as unappetizing as it sounds, but was considered a fancy dish that added a little flair to an otherwise sparse meal. Fish mold lives on today in vintage cookbooks, accompanied by bemused commentary from modern readers. It's not likely to come back, but it's a quirky culinary relic. Books made vinegar pie. It was this frugal dessert that was a clever stand-in for lemon pie when citrus was a luxury most could not afford. They made a tart filling that was surprisingly good for the flavor of lemons by combining vinegar, sugar, water, and a little bit of flour. Vinegar pie was magic because it was so simple. It was poured into a flaky crust, baked to perfection, and often topped with a sprinkle of sugar or a thin layer of meringue. The sweetness of the vinegar balanced out the sweetness, and the result was a surprisingly palatable dessert that made the most of pantry staples. The taste was not the only thing about this pie, it was about hope. A sweet treat, no matter how humble, could be a welcome distraction during hard times, a reminder of what it was like to be normal. Sunday suppers or community gatherings often served vinegar pie, whose tangy flavor and curious name were a topic of conversation. Vinegar pie is almost a thing of the past today, but it occasionally shows up in vintage recipe collections or as a curiosity among modern bakers. A reminder that even the barest ingredients can be turned into something worth sharing with a little creativity. That's right, boiled cow udder. You're either a Depression-era cook or incredibly brave if you've ever looked at a cow and wondered, I wonder what that part tastes like. Waste not, want not was embodied in cow udder, which would turn a regularly discarded part into a meal that fed hungry families. Preparation was simple but labor-intensive. But the udder had to be thoroughly cleaned, for obvious reasons, and then boiled for hours to soften its tough texture. It was cooked and sliced and served plain or fried for a little extra flavor. They'd smother it with gravy or toss it into a stew with vegetables if someone was feeling fancy. The flavor? It's mild and slightly sweet, but most people would say it's interesting. Ironically, cow udder was nutritionally a decent source of protein and calcium, but its usual role was in milk production. It's not a dish you'll see on modern menus, but its existence reminds us that a generation was resourceful enough to make do with what they had. Boiled cow udder might not have been a crowd favorite, but for families with empty plates, it was better than nothing, and for that, it should get a tip of the hat, or a cringe. During the Great Depression, if butter was gold, pancakes and cutlets were not the only comfort cooking people made out of the vegetable we just talked about because it is oh so resourceful. Potato soup was also a regular item at the top of the menu. People would usually use whatever basic vegetables they had to make the soup more varied, but even potatoes, some grounded black pepper and water went fine. Typically, though, people would barter for a few onions or carrots to spice the soup up for special occasions or when it had been a while since they had their last good bowl of hot soup. Especially in the winters, when people needed nutrition more than ever. In about 25 minutes, you had yourself a quality and healthy meal that kept your energy going for all the labor of the week. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Prune pudding is evidence that even in hard times, people still wanted a sweet ending to their meal. Fresh fruit was rare during the Great Depression, and prunes, with their long shelf life and natural sweetness, were the unsung heroes of dessert. They weren't glamorous, but they did the job. This was a humble pudding, stewed down to a thick, syrupy base. Prunes were often sweetened with sugar and spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg to improve. This recipe really made a name for itself during the mid-1930s to 40s when people were facing a dire shortage of eggs. Still, if you did not have even some potatoes on hand but still wanted a pancake to cheer your kids up, you would go for eggless pancakes. Some shortening, sugar, milk, and salt were all you needed to make this version of the beloved American dish, plus just some water to bind if you could not find any milk to spare. Lucky were the homes that had lard, as that really made for some fluffy and thick cakes, but complaining was not really something people did during those times. A simple recipe like this let them revisit the taste of pancakes from back when they had fully stocked fridges, after all. Speaking of molasses, they also went really great with some slow-baked beans. Molasses have a knack for adding a lot of deep flavor to a dish, and the fact that these were usually left overnight to absorb all of it made for probably the best baked beans people could get in those times. It was especially popular as a summertime meal. Baked beans were not too hard to get, not the tinned versions because those were still pricey. Once you had some, you would just leave them in water to soften, and then the beans would be baked for 8 hours straight overnight. Making it was a whole day, literally. But once you were done with the prep work, it was all just a waiting game, and this was one time where being patient really paid off. So, peanut butter stuffed baked onion might sound strange, but trust me, it's worth a try. We're taking a whole onion, hollowing it out, and stuffing it with peanut butter. Then, we're going to bake it until the onion is caramelized and sweet. It sounds like an odd pairing, but the salty, creamy peanut butter and the sweet onion actually complement each other really well. This dish was a unique way to combine protein and vegetables. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it was a clever way to make a filling meal out of inexpensive ingredients. Plus, onions were a staple in many households because they were stored well and added flavor to almost any dish. It was one of the more outlandish food recipes to come out of the Great Depression, and food historians Andrew Coe and Spick salads. Imagine a jello mold of vegetables, meat, or eggs squirming to the dinner table. But if that doesn't sound appetizing, you're not alone. These savory gelatin dishes were a common way to stretch ingredients during the Great Depression. Affordable and easy to prepare, gelatin was made from boiled animal bones. Families would toss in whatever scraps were available: cooked chicken, canned peas, shredded carrots, hard-boiled eggs, often flavored with broth or tomato juice to create a savory base. It turned out to be a strange mixture that looked like dessert, but tasted like a casserole. Some loved them because aspics were practical, and others hated them because they were so textural. It was filling, but not appetizing, the sight of meat suspended in a quivering jelly. Sunday suppers often featured these salads, served with crackers or bread to make the meal even heartier. Aspic salads are a punchline today, not a recipe, but they are a symbol of a generation that found a way to make do with what it had. They're a wobbly slice of history. Love them or hate them. Surprise spice cake is a prime example of how Depression-era cooks. Let's talk a little about snacking, shall we? So one very popular munch-heavy snack was biscuits that went along with this gravy made out of sausage drippings, and it actually enhanced the flavor more than you would think. Americans already ate a lot of biscuits before the Depression took place, but afterwards, they became a godsend. We are serious. Finding an extra biscuit was an entirely different experience in that era. Popular brands like the 1930s vintage car or the bourbon biscuit, Huntley and Palmer's, all kinds of biscuits that people could get their hands on were in hot demand, since you would never know if dinner or breakfast was guaranteed. Best to bide your time with some biscuits in that case. If they come with a killer dip, then that silver lining shines just a bit brighter. All right, let's talk about a real comfort food of the Depression: bean in tomato stew. Beans were a go-to ingredient during the Depression days because of how nutritious, affordable, and versatile they are. It's basically just what it sounds like: beans cooked in a tomato-based broth. But you could also throw in potatoes, carrots, and maybe even a little bit of rice for extra substance. The beans provided a good source of protein and fiber, while the tomato sauce added a burst of flavor. This stew could be enjoyed on its own or served over rice, bread, or even mashed potatoes if you were lucky enough to have them. Originally, Native Americans sweetened baked beans with maple syrup, but then someone decided to turn this protein into a stew, and hey, we're not complaining. It was a filling meal back in the day, and it's still cooked in many households around America where the budget is a bit too tight. In Texas as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on, especially in Indian American communities which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. Use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. In Texas as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on, especially in Indian American communities which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, bread pudding has been a subject of much discussion in the history books of our developments with food. It would be a bit of an undersell to call it polarizing, since some people claim it is the ultimate comfort food, and there simply is not anything like it. Others think it is an affront to the concept of bread and pudding simultaneously, and fails to really capture the benefits of either. Still, the makeshift recipes from the 1930s were worth trying then, and are still worth trying now, as they put bread pudding on the map and helped it stay there. It was a great way to repurpose leftover stale bread, and despite its record as the poor man's pudding, it was a common recipe in church cookbooks even before the recession hit. All you had to do was get some boiling water, sugar, spices, and bread, and sure, it was not the most appealing or appetizing lump of dough to eat, but it got you through the day, and in times of extreme scarcity, who could ask for more? Who says you need apples to make an apple pie? Not the Depression era, folks, that's for sure. This mock apple pie was a genius hack that used Ritz crackers as the crust and a sweet, sticky filling made from sugar, cinnamon, and water. It was a budget-friendly dessert that satisfied the sweet tooth without the need for expensive or hard-to-find ingredients. Plus, it was a great way to use up those stale crackers lurking in the back of your pantry. The Ritz mock apple pie became a Depression-era favorite, despite the fact that it was a pastry imposter. How did it work? The aromatic mixture of sugar, cinnamon, butter, lemon juice, and crackers combined to convince the taster's senses that the pie actually tasted of apples. Mock apple pie actually dates to the mid-1800s. During the wintertime, when apples were scarce and dried apple stores were used up, inventive home cooks would instead use soda crackers or stale bread. The more modern Ritz cracker version came about in the 1930s. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and make sure to tell us in the comments which one of these items you still have in your pantry to this day.